We have talked about emissions from agriculture and the food systems in a couple of contexts already. There's a strong wind, hopefully not too bad. But here is a new paper that is kind of a review on the transformations needed in the food systems to mitigate their impact on climate change. So I decided to summarize this again, and I'm going to use again this infographic from our world in data, which is a bit dated, but the relative sizes of the pools will not change much. So what are the environmental impacts of food and agriculture? Greenhouse gases, 26% of the greenhouse gases typically come from food systems. So there is the food and there is the non-food part of the food systems. So agriculture itself and the non-food systems emit 74%. Land use, 50% of the global habitable ice and desert-free land is used for agriculture. So forests, urban areas, shrubs, fresh water take up the rest of it. 70% of the global freshwater withdrawals happen for agriculture. Industry and households take up most of the rest. Eutrophication, 78% of the global ocean freshwater pollution comes from agriculture, and there is rest of it coming from other causes. And then biodiversity, 94% of mammal biomass excluding humans is in livestock, and that emission is included here as well. We know that livestock emit a lot of methane. If we start with the simple climate change ecosystem and food system interactions, it would look something like this. So you have the drivers, the ecosystems, and the climate system, and here are the feedbacks between them. So the drivers of the food systems typically include demographics, political, economic, social, technological, lifestyle, cultural, etc. So feasts, meat consumption, tributary powers, and so on and so forth in the political economic systems. And there are also weather derivatives and climate derivatives of trading grains, for example. And there are, of course, emissions from other sources as well to the climate system, which typically we think of as temperature, precipitation, extreme events, and so on. And that feeds to the drivers of the food systems as well, and the ecosystems, which include land, water, and ocean, soil, biodiversity, carbon storage, etc., have a feedback as well. And then these things have emissions where mitigation is possible, and climate system impacts these ecosystems where adaptation is considered typically to deal with what are unmanageable impacts. So if you go to the food systems, the ecosystem services feed into the food systems, and they have impacts on the ecosystems, deforestation for agriculture and nutrient runoff and so on, and drivers of climate change also feed into the food systems, of course, in terms of feedbacks. The food system itself has food supply and production, processing, storing, and food trade, food demand and consumption, and of course food loss and waste, which is a shame, but it still continues even in developing countries like India and China. So there are emissions and impacts there back and forth with the climate, with the outcomes and feedbacks, including things like food and nutrition outcomes, so human health, food and nutrition security, environmental outcomes like biodiversity, soil, water, and air quality, economic outcomes like livelihoods, business opportunities, and food trade, which, as you know from the Russian war on Ukraine, the wheat supply and fertilizer supplies have been hampered heavily, and that has affected everything here, including energy supply and coal burning increasing, and that's impact on climate system, which is an integral part of the food and climate interactions and ecosystems as well. Okay, social justice outcome, fair value chains, animal welfare, and shared externalities. So there are externalities that are not directly related, like the war affecting wheat supply to the rest of the world and creating issues for a country like India in wheat export, import, and so on. Pressure on India to export wheat to match the lack of export out of Ukraine, for example, due to war. The table provides a list of mitigation areas like improved crop management and supply chain, looks at food system responses, and provides examples of potential interactions with other food system outcomes, so food, nutrition, security, economic, environmental, and social. So I'm going to just read through them so that we are up to date on the review of this theme. This is a paper that just came out in Science, so it's the latest review. Improved crop management includes things like reducing nitrous oxide emissions from synthetic fertilizer applications. Synthetic fertilizer applications are important to current food systems, especially because manure and legumes can only provide a portion of total nitrogen demands of crop production. They have contributed to substantial gains in productivity of food crops, green revolution, extended lifespans, reduced child mortality, etc. are all indirectly or directly related to this, and they will continue to be important going forward because demand for food is expected to increase. However, overlapping of fertilizer has led to over-application of fertilizer has led to major environmental impacts, a serious perturbation of the nitrogen cycle, for example, where in the planetary boundaries concept it's supposed to have exceeded the limits already, even though not everybody agrees with that framework. Reducing methane emissions from paddy rice, implementation of new agricultural management practices, for example, alternative wetting and drying to reduce the flood irrigation, by many smallholder farmers globally requires massive input from extension services. So agricultural extension services have to do a lot of the hand holding, and this brings uncertainties about the effectiveness of the implementation of such management practices. Improving land use management for carbon sequestration and reducing its losses. Under drawdown course I have a whole section on land management, and also under natural climate solutions and so on. We have looked at this in various contexts, but the potential of carbon sequestration in agricultural land is debated. For example, issues with permanence, whether it's really stored away for a long time or is recycled annually or interannually or decadally. Although it could be, with regional and local variations, considered a co-benefit of improving cropland and grazing land management, restoration of peatlands and the reforestation of marginal and unimprovable agricultural lands should be a priority, but conflicts with increased demand for food. There are also biofuel arguments about using degraded, unimprovable agricultural lands for BECCS kind of applications, bioenergy and carbon capture and sequestration, but again not entirely implemented yet. Closing yield gaps, differences between yields under optimal conditions and those attainable in the real world in farmers' fields. Yield gap reduction has a substantial role to play in reducing the land needed for food, of course. Improving yield gaps relies primarily on nutrients like fertilizer and water management. In some areas, water required to close the yield gap might not be locally available, so transporting water has to be looked at in terms of access, quantity and quality, and physical and economic access, for example, as well. In terms of nutrients, some areas and regions of the world, such as sub-Saharan Africa, will need to increase their fertilizer use, and this will further increase greenhouse gas emissions. By contrast, many other parts of the world need to reduce fertilizer over applications. Using agroforestry. Agroforestry is a land sharing strategy that accommodates both agricultural production and biodiversity protection, resulting in improved nitrogen fixation, land and ecosystem health, and soil carbon sequestration, among other benefits. There are other livelihood benefits, social impacts on reducing migrant labors, improving children's health and education, women's health, and so on. However, their implementation of this strategy depends depends on landowners and managers accepting and adopting these practices, as well as various other socioeconomic barriers. Agroforestry suffers from similar challenges as conservation agriculture, low tillage, organic fertilizers, and so on. To be successful, it will require investment to facilitate uptake in a way that is beneficial to landowners and managements. So all these good practices always need incentivization and maybe even regulations, and maybe funding from offsetting with additional carbon sequestration under agroforestry and so on. The other mitigation area is improved livestock management. So using better grazing land management, improving manure management, and using higher quality feed. There are various new options for reducing methane emissions by changing feed practices for ruminants. For example, Roquetal suggested that introducing seaweed into diets of cattle can reduce their methane emissions by up to 80% by changing the bacterial community composition of their guts. I have a podcast on this in detail elsewhere. However, increasing the scale of seaweed harvesting would have large implications for marine ecosystems, including their carbon sequestration potential. So again, there is never a free meal, so we have to always do life cycle analysis to see the cost and benefit and overall mitigation on the greenhouse gas emissions and other environmental variables like air quality, water quality, nutrient pollution, etc. Reducing enteric fermentation. Two main strategies for reducing enteric fermentation include feed additives, and improving feed digestibility. Feed additives, while reducing greenhouse gas emissions from livestock, can leave toxic residues and have independent environmental impacts. So remember, it's either going into milk or the meat that we consume. Given the increasing risks from toxic residues and antibiotic and pesticide resistance, feed additives are not a clear way forward for mitigation from livestock management. There are other options like reducing nitrous oxide through manure management, sequestering carbon in pastures, implementing best animal husbandry and management practices. So these often are mentioned, some of these, in nature-based solutions or natural climate solutions. Using non-animal protein sources to reduce the environmental cost of livestock dependence for protein, and using microbial protein as feedstuff. Okay. In the improved supply chain, we have things like improving food transport and distribution. So mitigation options here take two general forms. In low and middle income countries where storage and processing facilities may be lacking, mitigation is geared towards reducing food loss through innovations in technology, for example, cold storage options. There goes my computer blanking out. In upper, middle, and high income countries, where use of technology and infrastructure is widespread, mitigation is geared toward improving energy use efficiency and transitioning towards renewable energy sources. A potential trade-off with the food system outcomes depends on the type of renewable energy sources used. For example, the potential impacts of biofuels on food security is well documented. Other items under the same category of improving supply chain include improving efficiency and sustainability of food processing, retail, and agri-food industries, improving energy efficiencies of agriculture, reducing food loss, and here we have a large share of food produced is never consumed. Reducing food loss would allow smaller yields to meet global food demand and also reduce emissions. Mitigation measures to address food loss often come in the form of innovations to improve the efficiency of food harvesting and processing. These innovations need to be both accessible and affordable to reach middle and smallholder farmers. Okay. Demand management, making dietary changes towards sustainable consumption and healthy diets. Behavioral changes are never easy and cannot be imposed without other unintended consequences, but nonetheless, in terms of example of potential interactions with other food systems outcomes, we can look at reduction in meat, especially beef and lamb consumption, being expected to have the biggest outcome for climate change and the environment, especially as food demand and especially for meat is projected to increase. A growing number of upper and middle income consumers overconsume food, contributing to food demand, GHG emissions, and food waste. For growing middle classes in India and China and other developing countries, more and more increased meat and fish consumption is also a kind of interaction with other food systems and socio-economic systems and unintended outcomes, I suspect. Switching to healthy diets and following food guidelines has the potential to improve environmental sustainability and mitigation of climate change and also improve health outcomes. However, healthy diets may be unaffordable and or inaccessible to most of the world's poor and marginalized. Okay, so healthy diets, organic food, for example, is a luxury item and only affordable for the rich and not affordable or accessible even to most of the world's poor and marginalized. Finally, reducing waste, of course. Food Waste Index report estimates that nearly 1 billion metric tons of food was wasted in 2019. Billion metric tons of food wasted. More than 60% of this waste was due to household waste, with food service and retail contributing 26 and 13% respectively. Reducing food waste has multiple co-benefits and provides synergistic outcomes for people by improving food security and regulating prices, and for the planet by reducing pressure on land, biodiversity, and climate change. So increasing wealth and growing middle class also tends to lead to more and more ordering in of food or going out to eat, which typically incurs more loss than cooking at home and saving it and reconsuming it and so on and so forth. Anyway, some of these messages are already there in other podcasts and not necessarily new. This is obviously a review, so it's okay to revisit some of the points, but let's leave this here for now, okay?